speaker is Terry O'Gorman. I'm sure we all know Terry. He's the president of the Australian Council for Civil Liberties and one of the most prominent people in Australia today and Queensland fighting for our civil liberties. Thank you, Terry.
When the Fitzgerald report was handed down in July 1989, I thought the bad times of the 70s and 80s were over. I never thought that I would have to live through another era of extremism. I saw the extremism of the 70s and 80s. It started in 1970 with the Springbok tour. Racially selected, police bust in from all over Queensland, much violence by the police. Many people at that time, students, saying, what is this all about? We went through all the other excesses of the Joe years. We had the right to march ban, 400 people arrested on 1 October afternoon, a matter of feet away out in King George Square as they tried to walk around the block simply because the government said they couldn't walk around the block to protest against the government. Now we have a return to that era, but it's far worse. The only thing we have not yet seen is the police being sent onto the street to flog demonstrators. And I approach G20 with much apprehension in that regard. I saw the effect that an absolute free rein given by the government and the police minister of the day, I saw the effect that that had on police in the 70s and 80s. Far too many of them felt they could do what they like and they did it with very little consequence. It has not yet got to that stage yet, but it is the police on the street who cause the problems. There might be a preparedness by the senior executive service to say we're not going to return to that era, but deal with police on the street, particularly in the context of G20, and we'll see then whether it is really as bad on the street as I'm concerned it will become. Because what has happened is we've had a return to a thumping majority. We've had a return to a Premier and an Attorney-General similar to Premiers and particularly police ministers in the 70s and 80s who just simply said, we will do what we like because we can. There is a thumping majority. There is no restraint of an upper house. And that is what we are seeing now. One of the fundamental things that came out of Fitzgerald, not particularly radical, but one of the fundamental things was there must be an obligation on government to consult before criminal laws are brought into effect. Not a particularly radical proposal. We have this arrogant boy, ex-conveyancer Attorney-General who relishes in not consulting, who relishes in having a secret cabal of advisors who give him the views that he wants to hear, and now look what we've got. We've got the Bleijie laws that have this effect. No consultation for the first lot that came in October. Brought in without notice in late afternoon in October. There must be something about October and LNP governments. October 1977, no debate, no notice. The Traffic Act was amended to ban street marches. October 2013, no notice, no debate. Bleijie laws were brought in. These Bleijie laws have this effect. If I'm a member of one of the 26 banned bike clubs and I am caught with a joint in the course of associating with my fellow bike club members, if it's you or I, we'd get a fine. Well, the bikie will get a fine. But the law provides that a judge has no say in it, must impose a mandatory minimum sentence on top of that fine of 15 years. How obscene, how absolutely draconian is that? And if you're an office bearer, add another 10 years. So the joint that brings a $300 fine, if that, becomes a fine plus 25 years. But it's not just bikies. When the heat was on 3 weeks ago, we had the Attorney General come out and say, well, it's going to apply to pedophiles. Now, unfortunately, pedophiles are not a good example to use in relation to unfairness and the criminal justice system. But the definition of association in the VLAD Act, the Vicious Lawless Association Disestablishment Act, what twisted personality dreamt that up? It is defined to include anyone. The word bikie does not appear once. And this whole bikie legislation has been surrounded by a propaganda of lies and misinformation. Yes, there was, on that night in September, a brawl between two bike clubs at Broadbeach. But there was no laid siege to the Southport police station. And it's the laid siege lie that the police started, that the media didn't question, that now has been repeated so often that it is used as justification for these laws. There was no laid siege. Look at the charges that were laid outside the watch house. 5, 8 banditos waiting outside the watch house for their mates to be released so they could drive them back to Brisbane where they'd come from. Varying reports of 6 to 10 police cars turned up and got stuck into the group concerned. I've sought video of it. Surprisingly, none available. But we saw the Attorney General release the camera video product of the police at the time of the brawl. We have got to an era in this state where extremism is worse than the Bleijie-Petersen era. I did not see the attack on judges that we are now seeing. I didn't see attack on criminal lawyers as a group. Oh, look, I got called a communist in Parliament, made the communists laugh. There was a bit of the individual attack, but an attack on judges, a consistent attack on judges, attacks on criminal lawyers as a group. And where have we got to? There was a sense of absolute surrealism as to this extremism of this government. When I watched Springborg the other night, frothing at the mouth, comparing the doctors, who's their natural constituency, in almost a spitting, dismissive fit as they're as bad as the unions. How dare the doctors, who are the natural constituency of this government, actually organise? We have a government that we must stop the extremism. There is no easy route to stopping it, but doing nothing is not an option. If you look at what has happened over the last 6 months, the degree of extremism that we've seen from this government, unfortunately, puts Bleijie-Petersen in the shade. The only difference between this government and Bleijie-Petersen is that he was around for 2 decades. Hopefully, Queensland is now more mature. Hopefully, the polls are right. Hopefully, Queensland has realised that fundamental civil liberties are important. Hopefully, we will see this government tossed out and a government brought in that is accountable to civil liberties and human rights concerns, where opponents are not ridiculed, where the judiciary are not ridiculed. I'm no great lover of Labor governments, but this government is just out there on its own. We must stop the extremism of this government. I will finish by reading a passage from a Supreme Court judgment of Justice Applegarth in mid-December, where he had cause to examine the solitary confinement regime. These are his words, not mine, reading from the policy of the government as a result of these unheralded, no consultation reforms. All criminal motorcycle prisoners, including if you're associate, Yandina 5, the librarian drinking at the Dayborough pub, if they go to jail for anything, not rape, not murder, not just drugs, for anything, will be subject to this. Out of cell time restricted to 2 hours a day. But they're gracious. They can be daylight hours. No visits from other criminal motorcycle club members, including family members. So if you've got a mother, a father, a sister, a brother who's said by the police to be a member of a motorcycle club, no, can't visit you. Only entitled to a 1-hour non-contact personal visit with family members only per week. See them through glass. And of course, the absurd wearing of the pink uniform. Let me finish by saying this. Our boy wonder Attorney General, our failed conveyancer, wants to bring in these laws because he's enamoured of some sheriff somewhere in the US who's done these things. What he fails to recognise, and what I think Queenslanders are recognising and are smarter than him, is what's happening in the US. The libertarian right has come together with the so-called civil liberties left, to the extent that right and left means anything, and they are demanding the dismantling of the supermax prisons and of the burgeoning prison population in the US, not for reasons of philosophy, not for reasons of civil liberties, but for reasons that the economy can't cop it. So you've got that situation in the US where finally the extremism that has brought about the worst rate of imprisonment in not only the Western world but close to the whole world is now turning around, and our Attorney General is enamoured of some crazy sheriff somewhere in the south who's doing things that he likes, like putting people and prisoners in pink uniforms. God spare us.